Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon here in California. Good evening in London. On behalf of the Armenian Studies program, I'm Professor Barlow derMugrdechian, welcoming you to our program today on the Armenian Genocide and America's global role. This is part of the Armenian Studies program at Fresno State's Fall Lecture Series, which is supported through funding from the Leon S. Peters Foundation. We thank them for their support. This semester, all of our programs and presentations have taken place online because of the pandemic, but if that should change in the spring semester, we'll let everyone know. Today, we're going to be hearing from Dr. Charlie Laderman from King's College in London. I'll be introducing him in just a moment. We're also happy to have with us today Ara Sarafian, who is the director of the Gomidas Institute in London. We're also happy to have him as well. Today's presentation will be one in which Dr. Lederman will give a presentation, and then Ara Sarafian, acting as a discussant, will make comments and ask questions, but we'll also open it up to all of you in the audience to be able to ask questions using the question and answer function, which is at the bottom of your screen. And you can write your questions out, and then we'll be reading those questions and responding to them as you do that at the end of the program. So I'd like to start first with just giving you a brief look at some of the upcoming programs of the Armenian Studies program, some of our upcoming events. So I'm going to share that screen. And actually, I'm going to do that one more time. Okay, so that tells you a little bit about some of our upcoming events. And if you would like to be on our email list, you can always send me an email. I'll share that with you a little later, and you can be on our list to receive information about our upcoming events. So I'm going to first introduce our discussant, Ara Sarafian, who is the founding director of the Gomidas Institute in London, which sponsors out and carries out research and publishes books on modern Armenian and regional studies. They do a lot of publications. Ara has been involved in English translations of Armenian texts, and he's also been involved with several initiatives in Turkey. And that's just a small part to say about Ara. So we're again happy to have him here to discuss the presentation after we complete it. Our speaker today is Dr. Charlie Laderman, who is a lecturer in international history at King's College in London. He was also a senior research associate at Peterhouse University of Cambridge, for the 2019 and 20 academic year. His first monograph is the book that we're going to be talking about, called Sharing the Burden, The Armenian Question, Humanitarian Intervention, Anglo-American Visions of Global Order. And that book received the Arthur Miller Institute Prize from the British Association for American Studies as the best first book on any American studies topic in 2019. The topic today is really, again, his book, Sharing the Burden, and it begins to explain how the Armenian struggle for survival became entangled up with the debate over the international role of the United States as it rose to a world power in the early 20th century. Well, I'm not going to just read to you about the book. We're very happy. Joining us today is Dr. Charlie Laderman to share with us his book and his thoughts about the topic. Dr. Laderman.
Thank you, Barlow, and thank you to the Armenian Studies program. It's an honour to be here, but to be physically and but to be virtually present with you. And thank you to all of you who are attending, and thank you to Ara for commenting. I very much admire the work of the Gomidas Institute, and it's a real pleasure to have him with us. I'm just going to share my screen, so I have a PowerPoint. So let me just bring that up. Go. Right, here we go. Let's go back to this. There we go. Great. So it's almost a year since the House of Representatives voted overwhelmingly to recognize the Armenian Genocide, and the Senate then followed suit a couple of months later. When we're thinking about the sort of lead up to a very fraught and bitter election at the moment, and at a time where there seems to be few issues that have brought about any sort of bipartisan consensus in American politics or in the US Congress, I think it's very important to remember this anniversary, because that was one that certainly in the House and then by December in the Senate had brought about a real sense of bipartisan consensus. And with that in mind, what I intend to do today is to take up the challenge issued by Congress with that resolution, which was to encourage education and public understanding of the facts of the Armenian Genocide, including the American role in the humanitarian relief effort and the relevance of the Armenian Genocide to modern-day crimes against humanity. Specifically, as Barlow mentioned, what I'm going to try to explain today is why the struggle for survival of one of the world's smallest nations became so entangled in the foreign policy of the United States as it rose to world power. But I'm not going to just leave things in the history. At the end, I want to talk very much about the possibilities, limitations, and continued dilemmas of humanitarian intervention today. Now, I'm not going to say that the debates over intervention for the Armenians at the end of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th century, and the ones that we have had today over issues such as Syria, are directly analogous. As L.P. Hartley said, the past is indeed a foreign country, and they did do things differently then. American interests and security fears, the nation's place in the world, are certainly not the same today as those that it faced a century ago. But some of the dilemmas that statesmen faced were comparable. And so what I want to do is to discuss a few of them towards the end of the talk. And I'll also talk and touch briefly upon the British response, and I'd be happy to go into more detail about that during the Q&A. That is a crucial part of the book that Barlow mentioned, but in the interest of time, and as I've been given a clear cut-off time, I will devote these opening comments to the American story. It was especially apt that it was the House of Representatives that took the lead in recognizing the Armenian Genocide and calling for the United States to help prevent modern crimes against humanity. But it was around 120 years ago that another House resolution regarding the Armenians confirmed a fundamental departure in US foreign policy. This is something that I talk about at the outset of my book. This resolution signaled that the United States was becoming a great power with global responsibilities, and that it would no longer remain aloof to events beyond its hemisphere. The earlier House resolution occurred in the wake of the first large-scale Armenian massacres, which ultimately claimed the lives of roughly 100,000 Armenians between 1894 and 1896, and they of course served as a precursor to the even greater crimes of 1915. When reports of atrocities by Ottoman Sultan Abdul Hamid's forces and Kurdish irregulars first filtered into the United States in the mid-1890s, American humanitarianism initially followed the conventional customs of the 19th century. That is, that private charities and churches took the lead in marshalling the relief efforts. The federal government, on the other hand, declined to involve itself diplomatically in the crisis or to concern itself with addressing the causes. The idea was that this was occurring in the old world, in the heart of European geopolitics, and the United States had no reason to be involved in that. But as public outrage grew, petitions began pouring into Congress, appealing for American action to aid the Armenians. Aware that their nation was rapidly emerging as a leading industrial power, and that Congress had recently appropriated funds for a whole range of new modern warships that would transform the US Navy ultimately into the most powerful one in the world, many Americans now urged their representatives to use this power to address the greatest humanitarian atrocity of the age. In early 1896, the House and the Senate both passed resolutions calling for President Grover Cleveland to intervene to help and to, quote, stay the hand of fanaticism and lawless violence in the Ottoman Empire. Now, this was an unprecedented step, the first time that a branch of the federal government had outlined a political solution to a humanitarian problem occurring outside the Western Hemisphere. Now, ultimately, congressional agitation did not lead to executive action beyond sending a couple of those new warships to the Eastern Mediterranean to protect the rights of American missionaries caught up in the cataclysm. But the resolutions revealed that a bold new spirit now infused American diplomacy. And as calls grew for the United States to address a humanitarian problem closer to home, that of Spain's oppression in Cuba, interventionists justified this by consistently invoking the persecution of the Armenians in the Ottoman Empire. This analogy was particularly prominent in the mass circulation newspapers of William Randolph Hearst, who sensationalized the Cuban issue and contributed to this increasingly belligerent mood. His San Francisco Examiner urged Americans to recognize that Cuba is our Armenia and it is at our door. Now, when the United States does intervene in Cuba and the Europeans don't intervene in Armenia, this is taken as showing that the United States was emboldened and was infused by a very different sort of moral principle in its foreign policy. And this was something which was brought up again and again by advocates of intervention. Now, from his bully pulpit, President Roosevelt, Theodore Roosevelt, after assuming office in 1901, articulated a set of principles outlining America's responsibility to intervene in response to what he called crimes against civilization, the first articulation of that term. The 1894-6 Armenian massacres and the failure of any power to do anything about them profoundly impacted Roosevelt's thinking. He would frequently invoke Armenian suffering as a symbol of man's inhumanity and the clearest justification for righteous wars. And he would reference the Armenians when protesting against anti-Jewish pogroms in Tsarist Russia. As you can see, this is a cartoon showing the diplomatic protest, but it's something that in private he was making a comparison with what occurred to the Armenians in the Ottoman Empire. And he would also refer to the Armenians when he intervened diplomatically against King Leopold's brutal regime in the Congo. Now, most Americans shared Roosevelt's horror at these atrocities, but some disagreed with how he had chosen to respond. In the case of Roosevelt's protest against pogroms in Romania and Russia, former Secretary of State Richard Olney led the accusations from the Democratic side that Roosevelt's actions were merely a ruse to secure Jewish votes for re-election. And Olney condemns Roosevelt for lecturing a foreign state, as he calls it, upon the management of its internal affairs. The sense was, what would happen if another nation responded in kind and said that what was going on in the United States at that time, lynchings in the American South, were disgracefully frequent and Washington would do well to bestir itself and put a stop to them. Now, others shared Olney's concern. In 1903, there were 99 recorded lynchings, the overwhelming majority against Black Americans. And this frenzy of mob-executed ritual violence led Mark Twain to label his country the United States of Lyncherdom. And it's not just Americans who were picking up on this. The international press, not least in Russia, were also gleefully exposing this paradox. And so when Roosevelt protests against pogroms, Russia's ambassador issues a counter objection to American lynchings. Now, Roosevelt feels very uncomfortable with this because he had been very outspoken, at least in rhetoric, in condemning lynchings. He didn't necessarily see what the federal government could do to intervene, but he was of the opinion that the United States and the American public should, as he said it, take a resolute attitude of protest against every wrong that outraged the civilization of the age at home or abroad. And so in his 1904 address to Congress, Roosevelt outlines a set of principles governing both humanitarian intervention abroad and the way in which the United States should behave at home. He proclaimed that Americans should prioritize dealing with their own sins, most critically violent race prejudice, over protesting against wrongdoing elsewhere. But what Roosevelt says is that despite America's own very obvious shortcomings, he believed that America had a duty to censure international wrongdoing because it had, on the whole, demonstrated its commitment to principles of civil and religious liberty and orderly freedom. What's more, there were occasional crimes committed on so vast a scale, Roosevelt said, and of such peculiar horror that in some extreme cases, action may be justifiable. Now, the cases in which the US should intervene, as it does against Cuba in 1898, are necessarily few, but Roosevelt makes very clear that it is inevitable that America should desire eagerly to give expression to its horror when it witnesses such systematic and long extended cruelty and oppression of which the Armenians had been victims. Now, this set of principles of intervention doesn't make much of an impression in America, but it certainly does abroad. And there is huge uproar about the possibility of further American intervention in Europe. A French author, Henry Hauser, characterizes this as humanitarian imperialism and warns Europeans that the governance of the world is no longer just something the Europeans will be concerned about, it's something where the United States is going to soon be taking the lead. Roosevelt's message raises hopes among Armenians, Jews, and their supporters in the United States that he would interfere more vigorously on their behalf. But after reports of renewed Armenian massacres in 1904, Roosevelt is urged to intervene and doesn't do so. He believes that the muted American response to his message ultimately should caution him in his actions. And he tells an advisor that while he personally was entirely satisfied, in his words, to head a crusade for the Armenians, this country has not the remotest intention of fighting on such an issue. He had tried to rouse Americans, but accepted they had no desire to back up words by deeds. While they were often eager to protest abuses by other nations, they weren't willing to build up the instruments of power that Roosevelt recognized were essential to make such protests effective. And for the rest of his presidency, Roosevelt was very cautious. In response to appeals, he invoked a dictum that he had learned as a rancher: never draw unless you mean to shoot. But even while pursuing this cautious approach, Roosevelt remains convinced that if the opportunity should arise, then the US must intervene for the Armenians. And so, when a few years later, in 1915, amidst the turmoil of the First World War, reports reached the United States, which was then neutral in that conflict, that the Ottomans were perpetrating new atrocities against their Armenian subjects, the now former president was the most vocal proponent of American intervention in the conflict. To Roosevelt's disgust, the US official response was characterized by restraint. So although the American public responded with impassioned expression of philanthropy to save the survivors, as you can see from these iconic posters from the American Committee for Relief in the Near East, ultimately, while this contributes one of the largest philanthropic operations, certainly private philanthropic operations in American history, on the flip side, the official US response is characterized by restraint. President Woodrow Wilson is concerned that public condemnation of one of Germany's principal allies would compromise American neutrality in a conflict that he and most Americans at the time wished to stay out of. Even after the US enters the war against Germany and Austria-Hungary in 1917, Wilson avoids declaring war on their Ottoman ally. Now, this approach disgusts Roosevelt. He publicly declares that the Armenian massacre is the greatest crime of the war and failure to act against Turkey is to condone it. Roosevelt believed that America was fighting in a common cause with Britain and France, and not declaring war on all the Central Powers was a show of bad faith towards our allies. Above all, he was adamant that if America failed to vindicate the Armenians by punishing the Ottomans, it would reveal all talk of guaranteeing the future peace of the world was, in his colourful phrase, mischievous nonsense and insincere claptrap. Now, Roosevelt's position reflected a consistent conviction that nations must uphold their most cherished values by force if necessary when they were challenged. America's unwillingness to make this sacrifice on behalf of the Armenians compromised any claim that it had to be the guardian of the highest civilized ideals. On the other hand, Wilson did not conceive of a military solution, and certainly not during the war. He believed that the failure of the Allied assault on Gallipoli in 1915 had already underlined the difficulties in invading Turkey. Wilson's prime concern at this time was the defeat of Germany, and unlike Roosevelt, he did not believe it was America's duty to declare war on the Ottomans in order to vindicate the Armenians. The principal domestic community with interests in the Near East were American missionaries, who had been active in the Ottoman Empire from the outset of the 19th century, developing a more extensive network there than any other nationality group. By contrast, America's economic interests in the Near East were minimal at this time. It was missionaries who were the far more influential aspect of American policy. But while administering humanitarian relief to the Armenians, they were insistent that America refrain from declaring war on the Ottomans. Firstly, they were fearful that the preeminent position that they had developed in the Ottoman Empire over the past century would be jeopardized. But they also thought that military intervention would threaten American interests and risk worsening the Armenian situation by impeding relief efforts. The missionary determination to remain on friendly terms with the Ottomans dovetailed nicely with Wilson's larger foreign policy goals. First, stay out of the war, and then, once in, keep your eye on the bigger picture. For Wilson, the Ottoman Empire was only relevant as an ally of Germany. In Wilson and the missionaries' mind, it was, as one critic at the time pointed out, not Deutschland über alles, but Deutschland über alle. Once Germany was defeated, the threat to world peace would vanish and the Ottoman Empire would collapse. Now, it's not often appreciated, certainly not on a public level, that the US went to war with Germany and Austria-Hungary, but not with the Ottoman Empire, nor that the US was an associated power in the First World War rather than an ally. Why was that? Well, above all, and contrary to Roosevelt, Wilson distrusted Allied imperialism, and he didn't want the US involved in what he saw as an Allied war for control of the Middle East. And this is the principal reason why he ultimately decides against declaring war on the Ottomans. But that's not to say that the Armenian question wasn't significant to Wilson. The apparent inaction that he engages in during the war ultimately belies the outsized role that the Armenian issue would come to play in his own vision of reforming global politics. At the end of the war, Wilson wanted Americans to take the lead in establishing a reformed international system, one in which the Ottoman Empire would be dismembered and the security of its subject peoples guaranteed. And in this new order, he wanted the United States to play a special role in Armenia. So, as well as urging American membership of the League of Nations, Wilson hoped that it would help the surviving Armenians to establish their own state. You get a sense of this in Wilson's own papers at the Library of Congress with this map of a vision of what a potential Armenian state would have looked like. For Wilson, an American mandate for the nascent Armenian Republic through the League was seen as a manifestation of this new order. He ultimately sends commissions to the Middle East, like, of course, General James G. Harbord, the American Chief of Staff on the Western Front, the commission that he ultimately leads to look into the possibility of a mandate. And this is the map that's drawn up of a potential American mandate. But as opposition to the League grows, Wilson is forced to subordinate his commitment to an American mandate in the Middle East for Senate approval for ratification of the Versailles Treaty and the League. Like Wilson, his opponents in the Senate come to associate an American mandate for the Armenians with League membership, whereas Wilson perceives it as a symbol of American selflessness and moral leadership. His opponents interpret it as evidence of the unrewarding and open-ended commitments that the League was going to impose. Now, Wilson's growing commitment to the Armenian cause is ultimately met by increasing American hostility to international commitments of any kind. For Republican leader Henry Cabot Lodge and the rest of Wilson's opponents, the US was being burdened with what they described as the world's poorhouse, while its former associates in the war, Britain and France, seized more lucrative territories in the Middle East. Wilson's critics claimed it was unconstitutional to tax Americans for altruistic service to other peoples or to send American troops to what they saw as a war-torn region. They summoned up George Washington's farewell address and the Monroe Doctrine as evidence that the United States should preserve its policy of non-entanglement in the affairs of the old world. And most significantly, they feared that Wilson was simply using a mandate for Armenia as America's backdoor to entry into the League of Nations. Their position was summed up by Senator Warren Harding, who would succeed Wilson as president in 1920, and he declared, "I am not insensible to the sufferings of Armenia, but I'm thinking of America first. Safety as well as charity begins at home." Now, that rhetoric of America first is first used in the 1920 campaign by Harding in a very narrowly nationalistic sense. And ultimately, Wilson's request for an Armenian mandate becomes a regular point of attack as part of Harding's America First campaign. The debates in Congress reflect those in the country at large, and you get a sense of that from looking at these two cartoons at the time. This one from the New York Evening World, showing Congress crying crocodile tears over the Armenian issue and doing nothing to help, whereas for opponents, the situation looked more like this cartoon from the San Francisco Chronicle, which is that John Bull, Great Britain, was seizing all the most lucrative territories across the world as mandates, Mesopotamia, Persia, particularly areas that had oil, whereas the United States was being given a mandate that didn't have resources or lucrative products like oil. So what we see is that appeals to America's historic world role mingle with a desire to limit international responsibilities and to refrain from burdensome overseas commitments. The question of America's duty to Armenia ultimately stimulates a public debate over the very character of the American nation. A New Republic editorial says, "If we fail at this juncture to vindicate Armenia's right to freedom, we shall never again persuade the world that our moral sentiments are anything but empty rhetoric playing over a gulf of selfishness and sloth." Yet for others, there was a fundamental difference between private expressions of charity and a political commitment to Armenian security. The Republican election platform in 1920 argued no more striking illustration can be found of President Wilson's disregard for the lives of American boys or American interests than his request for an Armenian mandate. Americans should not confuse the humanitarian and material aid they should extend and the political control that they needed to avoid. Now, as we know, ultimately Wilson was unable to convince Americans to join the League, and his request to assume a mandate was also rejected. Correspondingly, deprived of protection, Armenian independence was short-lived, crushed between Bolshevik expansion and Turkish nationalism. Although the United States was unable to prevent the wartime atrocities or to secure Armenia's independence in the aftermath, I don't think that this should detract from the importance of the issue during a pivotal period in American history. As American power expands at the turn of the 20th century, so does the sense that the nation should use its strength to aid oppressed minorities and persecuted peoples such as the Armenians. Events that would have been lamentable but unresolvable earlier in the 19th century, occurring in regions beyond America's reach, now provoke intense debate over whether the US should respond, and if so, how. Now, the humanitarianism was selective and the subjects of interest were overwhelmingly religious-based. And American concern ultimately did not lead to political commitments, with the official US response to the Armenian plight largely limited to relief and rhetoric. But in attempting to convince their fellow countrymen of their responsibility to Armenia, both Roosevelt and Wilson extended the parameters of debate on the purpose of American power and the nature of the national interest. Their search for a solution to the Armenian question would encapsulate the nation's internal conflict over its world role. Now, as I said, I wanted to finish with a number of dilemmas that come out of this historic episode that I think are still relevant and continue to bedevil American policymakers today. Firstly, there's the problem of ensuring that presidential rhetoric does not become detached from political realities. That is demonstrated most clearly by Roosevelt's dictum, "Never draw unless you mean to shoot." That maxim, I would say, offers an abiding lesson for statecraft, if one that is often ignored. Yet even while pursuing this cautious approach, Roosevelt remained convinced that if the opportunity arose, then the US should intervene for the Armenians. This illustrated a second competing dilemma of how far a leader should go to reconcile his personal ideals with the electorate's conception of the nation's interests. Now, during his presidency, Roosevelt publicly promoted the Armenian cause as far as he felt possible, but accepted that despite their sympathies, few Americans believed that action for the Armenians was compatible with American interests. Wilson faced this predicament even more acutely in his attempts to secure a mandate, with his opponents pointing to it as evidence that the president's sense of America's world role and its internationalism was utterly divorced from the national interest and designed to benefit other nations like Britain at America's expense. The backlash against Wilson's idealism and the reluctance to assume broader international commitments reflects a pattern that we will see repeat itself on other occasions where policy is seeming to be guided by excessively utopian thinking. Yet in responding to the Armenian crisis, Wilson was forced to wrestle with a third dilemma that every would-be intervener in the wake of a humanitarian atrocity faces. Either you assume the burden of administering the territory, or you force the oppressor to mend their ways. And having decided the US should assume the burden, Wilson faced a related fourth dilemma over the legitimate basis for an intervention. Did it require the mandate of an international organization, like the League of Nations then or the United Nations today, as Wilson proposed? Or should it be pursued either unilaterally or with a coalition of willing partners, as Roosevelt insisted? Ultimately, however, all those who worked to resolve the Armenian question for over 3 decades were confronted with the cruelest dilemma of all, that sometimes it is simply not possible to achieve a good solution. Now, Wilson made sure that he never forgot the Armenian tragedy. You can see here, he was very much at the forefront of these debates and was seen as the figure who was going to be coming in as the leading figure. In November 1917, a delegation of Armenians had visited the White House, and they had presented Wilson with a portrait of a young Armenian girl in traditional dress. The girl's haunted expression, as you can see here, symbolized the destruction of her nation. In her hand, however, she clasped a mountain snowdrop, a flower whose appearance Armenians regard as a sign that winter was over and spring was on its way. The Armenians' faith that better days were ahead was captured by the painting's inscription, L'Espérance, hope. The portrait was displayed in the White House for the remainder of Wilson's term. After leaving office, the former president brought the painting to his new home in Washington, D.C., where it continues to hang over the fireplace in the drawing room to this day, a constant reminder of the tragic question that neither he nor any other American was able to resolve. Thank you.
Thank you. So we're going to ask, at this time, we'll ask Ara Sarafian to make some comments and perhaps point out some questions. And we have opened up the question and answer panel. So those of you that do have questions in this period, you can also write your questions. Ara?
Yes, Charlie, first of all, thank you for your presentation. I'm not surprised that this is an award-winning book, because you've tackled so many issues in such an eloquent manner, and in some ways made them relevant to us today. Your starting point was that the Senate voted on recognition of the Armenian Genocide, to learn from the experience, in a sense, to work towards a non-repetition of such events in the future, a greatest awareness. But there's something tragic in your work, because in some ways, in analyzing what happened with the Armenian Genocide, what we see the difficulties from moving from an idealistic situation where you work for the good, to the practicalities of how idealisms can be lost in the reality of politics, and with domestic audiences, in diplomatic circles, other interest groups. In many ways, you're showing it's not a failure of a system, that this is a system, and that is the nature of our understanding of the world that we are living in, and the fact that not just the League of Nations that failed, but in many ways the United Nations has failed, and that's the reality of the world that we're living in today. And all of this, I have to say, all of this links to what's happening in the Caucasus today. Once more, we have a situation of, I obviously believe it's a clear-cut question of blatant aggression by states. And when the firing starts, for all the ideals, state interests take over, even in well-meaning states like the United States, where there are internal divisions and there are opportunistic circles that are trying to benefit from this, and oil companies and other rivalries with Russia and so forth. And the little guys and the idealism in many ways gets lost in the real politics, in the Machiavellian world that we are living in. And maybe is this something that we should stress more, that it is a tragedy that we're looking at, and the tragedy is systemic. It didn't just happen. I mean, the Armenians did have Woodrow Wilson. They did have advocates. They did push their issues so much. I mean, that is remarkable, right? From Hamidian massacres to World War I and so forth. And still they failed to such an extent. And again, it's a very tragic way of looking at it. And maybe we should address a tragedy in much more forthright terms if we really want to make a difference. Say never again means never again, rather than acknowledging the terrible world we're living in and then saying, well, how can we make the tragedies work for us against others? And sort of, again, become Machiavellian ourselves. So I absolutely love your book. I think it is a remarkable book. I would recommend all Armenians, in fact, diplomatic historians, to read it. I wish it was a happier book in many ways, and it's not. And I personally think that we should talk in these terms, especially today, where Armenians themselves are fighting in an existential struggle. The whole world is watching like a movie, and the good guys are almost paralyzed. They don't know what to do. I mean, you can see what's happening in the United States, Russia, and whatnot. And you have a country like Turkey out and right backing, an Azerbaijan in an aggressive context, and there's nothing we can do. Although, there are the idealists. We are out here, and I'm not talking about Armenians, even non-Armenians. Good doesn't necessarily triumph over evil, and we need to be much more vocal about that and much more critical about that. So maybe I should start on this black sort of note of, see the darker side of our characters and the world that we're living in, and maybe that is a responsible way of responsible focus that we should have in these debates, rather than saying, there's a heroic struggle. We try, we fail, but there's something heroic about it. Well, the word I would use is actually tragedy, and a systemic tragedy, and that's mainly because of what we can see happening even today in the South Caucasus. Can I leave you with that sort of
No, I think that's really, I think you summed it up really beautifully there, and I think that's actually something which I don't think I realized. I sat down to write the book with an idea of looking at lessons in humanitarian intervention. I was very much someone who was politicized by the debates of the 1990s and early 2000s, where we were talking about interventions, where the UN was talking about a responsibility to protect. We were looking at what was going on say in Kosovo, and some of these debates, the non-intervention in Rwanda, I was very much looking to my research to play a role in this. And it wasn't really until I got to the end of the book that it really sort of became very much stark to me that, as you say, that this was that I had written a tragedy. And I think one of the things that, just to sort of pull out some aspects of hope within this, I think you're right that there's elements that the system will obviously work against this. I think the United States at that time, I think, had less geopolitical interests than they do today. And as a result, sort of intervention in some senses was more possible, but was also less realistic in that sense. And it's how do you balance those interests and ideals? And I think Roosevelt in particular was wrestling with that. And I think his understandings on this are quite important for us today. But there's also moments in the book where an intervention might have happened. So early 1919, Charles Evans Hughes, who becomes Secretary of State under Warren Harding and is a major advocate for the Armenians, says that we have this opportunity then. We have a large army abroad. For the first time, really, the United States had never had a large army abroad in Europe, but they do in 1919. And Hughes says that was the moment. And he was an advocate at that point of sending troops along with the British and the French to help police what was going on after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. And then he says, unfortunately, that moment passed. And I think that's an important thing just to think of, that there are these moments where statesmen and stateswomen have to act. And if they don't, it becomes very difficult. The other thing that I think is really important to bear in mind, as you say, in terms of today, is we tend to think of interventions like this as being sort of purely idealistic, that they're not tied up in the strategic interests of the state. And I would dispute that on the sense that when we see the decline of international standards, and we see this after what happens to the Armenians during the First World War and into the interwar years, when nations have been able to get away with large-scale atrocities, and it's seen that the international community haven't done anything, that has a really big effect. And it does lead to what a British scholar at the time, Alfred Zimmern, talking about what happens with the Armenians, says that we see the decline of international standards. Once those standards fall, other nations feel that they can get away with things. And obviously the most famous example when we're talking about the Armenians is Hitler's famous quotation that he makes to his troops just before the invasion of Poland, who today remembers the Armenians. And I think we're seeing something, not obviously that was on an unprecedented scale, but we're looking today at the fact that what occurred in Syria, that no one did anything to stop the atrocities that were occurring in Syria, and as a result, nations feel emboldened to act in aggressive ways. And we're seeing that with Turkey today. We're seeing that with the use of those who had fought in Syria being sent into the Caucasus today. So that sense, I think, is very important, that there's moments of action, but also if you don't act, then it can really sort of undermine international norms, standards, conventions in general, and that leads to a deteriorating international environment.
Okay, we have a couple of questions. I'm going to read one, and we'll start from there. The question is, were there voices of dissent that offered opportunities to break the cycle of "we have no friends, only interests" approach to international relations? This person has done some studies of the desecration of synagogues during the Shoah, and the follow-up question is, why weren't the voices of the people heard?
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And I do think that, to a certain extent, one of our problems that we have today is that we look back on some of these figures of this period as being sort of indicative of that Machiavellian approach to politics that Ara mentioned, that we think about this in relation to someone like Theodore Roosevelt. He's very much held up as sort of a paragon of sort of realism, and sort of the American national interest trumps all. But actually, what we're seeing here is a way of trying to balance some of these things. And I think more so than perhaps of a later generation. I'm working on a book at the moment on Franklin Roosevelt, And what we see there is that Roosevelt, I think, is a masterful politician, and is trying to balance these things, but I think is less sort of imbued with the idea of politics as a moral space as Theodore Roosevelt. And Roosevelt, I think, is a very interesting figure within this, that he is trying to find ways to bring those two things together. And I think what's interesting, again, it comes back to these moments. At the beginning of 1919, there's a large swathe of American opinion in favor of a mandate. And there's certainly the American Committee for the Independence of Armenia has governors from about 20 states on its signed up to sort of its platform. There's a large swell of public opinion in the United States and a bipartisan appeal to get involved in what's going on in the Near East. And I think what happens is there becomes a growing sort of jadedness and disillusionment as the debate over the League of Nations goes on. So we see this is that ultimately the United States is in a position, because of its power, because of its detachment from some of the sort of old world concerns, that it can be more moral in its politics. But as a result, it doesn't have the pull to get involved that other nations do.
Yeah, I'm gonna ask you a question. You if you could comment on the similar debate that took place in Great Britain at the same time, right? In the 19th century, there was great debate about the Armenian question. And were there any attempts to tie the two movements in the United States and Great Britain? These both, some sort of trying to bring both of them together for humanitarian intervention?
Yes, certainly. So William Gladstone is not just a hero to British liberals, he's also very much a hero to American liberals, and particularly to Woodrow Wilson, who has a bust of Gladstone in his office in the White House. And so what we see here is that this shared sympathy for the Armenians becomes a way that British policymakers from about the 1890s onwards, and they look to that as a way to bind the United States and Britain closer together. And there's talk in the mid-1890s of a joint intervention on behalf of Armenians in about 1896. And this is sort of the first time that British and American policymakers are talking about an intervention of this kind. Now, it's also tied up in sort of the protection of American interests, of American missionaries in the region. It's tied up with British imperial interest, but what's being used as sort of the glue to bring those two interests together are these humanitarian sentiments. And so we see that in the 1890s, and then we also see it in 1919 and 1920 as well. The British want the League of Nations to essentially be an Anglo-American alliance. Now, they have very cynical reasons for that as well, because it's tied up in sort of in the sort of maintenance of the British Empire at a time where Britain is worried about its commitments. But there is a sense as well that Britain is using its humanitarian ideals as an important part of its imperial mission. It's not just rhetoric. I think what we see here is a whole range of British figures like James Bryce and others who are very much invested in this. They're invested in an Anglo-American alliance. They're invested in the Armenians, and they think that together the two things can be linked, that essentially you could have an Anglo-American alliance that would police the Middle East and would protect Christians. Now, ultimately, that doesn't come to pass, but I think it's a very important moment in Anglo-American relations. I think it's very much a forerunner to things that we were to see after the Second World War. But at the time, it leads, as I showed in those cartoons, to a real sort of backlash against Britain. And these things aren't forgotten as we go into the sort of 20s and 30s. Both sides are very much distrustful of each other, the Americans and the British, because nothing is done about this issue. And they blame each other.
Okay, there's another question. This is dealing with conflict resolution. So the question is, could you elaborate about the March 16th, 1921 Moscow Agreement between Lenin and Ataturk, Russia, Communist Russia and the Turks, nationalist movement, and maybe the Madrid Principles as a basis for conflict resolution? Can you elaborate in any way? I mean, that's...
So you mean the Madrid Principles? I mean, do you mean that in relation to, when I think of the Madrid Principles, I'm thinking about some of the some of the negotiations that go on between the Israelis and the Palestinians. Is that what you have in mind, or no?
Yeah, I'll have to get their answer because I'll have to wait a minute to see if they can answer that.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that's quite interesting is, and as I know less about what occurs in 1921 between Lenin and Ataturk, but I do know that the Ataturk in 1919 is actually much more open to the idea of an American presence in the Middle East than later mythology will have it. So it's something which I cover in my book in quite a lot of detail. An American journalist goes to the Sivas Congress of Turkish nationalists in 1919, and Ataturk is asking at that time for an American mandate. Now, this is a time where the Ottoman imperial government is sort of under the whip hand of the British. The Turkish nationalist movement isn't going well in the East. It's very much being used for reasons of sort of bolstering Kemal's nationalist movement. But there is, again, when I was talking about moments there is an opportunity there for a potential way of moving towards, and as I say, this may have been sort of ephemeral, whether it actually existed in the way in which, it was a very sort of small window. But at that time, we don't necessarily see the what is going to occur in 1920 with the sort of the crushing of Armenian independence between Turkish nationalism and Russian Bolshevism. We tend, I think, to look back and think of things as inevitable because of what we know later happened. But at times, there are these moments where things are far more contingent and things could have gone in a different direction. And I think Kemal's engagement with the possibility of an American mandate is a very interesting part of that.
Yes, I think the question, so it was just looking at ways of conflict resolution, and then they're giving examples. The questioner said examples of between Armenia and Azerbaijan, let's say 1990, to settle the issues, and 2006 maybe. I'm not sure about that one, but I don't know if that.
I think.
Yeah.
I know less about the sort of the individual cases that are being mentioned. I think what we're seeing today is, in 1990, 2006, we're seeing sort of a large scale role for the United States as in the international. I mean, it's the height of American power in 1990. 2006 is still a time where the United States plays an important role in the world. And I think what's different is whether the United States will continue to look at what's going on in the Caucasus and believe that it has a major role in helping to bring about any sort of diffusion of tensions there. That's something which I think is sort of up for grabs at the moment. And I think these things are tied into sort of the broader nature of the international system. I think we can't sort of look at them in isolation. We have to understand sort of broader regional and global power dynamics.
Okay, and Ara, are you there? We have lost Ara for a moment. So there's another question. Should the Armenian community pursue the Treaty of Sèvres, in which was scrapped, of course, by the Treaty of Lausanne? And also the question, it's a contemporary question, will the international community recognize Artsakh in today's conflict? So it's two separate questions, I think, but we're similar.
Yeah, I mean, the Treaty of Sèvres is obviously a very different treaty to what ultimately gets decided at Lausanne in 1923. I mean, it's and obviously what occurs at San Remo before Sèvres is also very different as well. And we see the sort of way in which the Middle East evolves at that time, and the way in which things move away. And yes, without a doubt, as Winston Churchill famously says, you when looking at the Treaty of Lausanne, you search in vain for the name Armenia, whereas obviously in the Treaty of Sèvres, there's a much more prominent role. And that's after the United States has sort of retreated from the scene. Obviously, they're asking for the mandate, the British and the French, but by that point, they're almost looking to pass off responsibility on the United States. Whereas in 1919, I think before that, there is a sense to which you could have had a very, very different Middle East. But at the same time, the British and the French, I think, use the fact that they're waiting for the Americans as an excuse to not have to deal with some of the difficult problems in the Middle East, but ultimately by holding out for the ideal solution of an American involvement, they end up with a far worse situation. So I think, again, like with all of these situations, there are these moments and there are ways in which powers can push things in their direction, and it comes back to how you use them.
Ara, did you have another question or point you could discuss with Charlie?
Yeah, I thought it'd be interesting to ask whether you see a practical way of making your work more relevant in some ways within teaching, since that's again where we started. Are there any moves in that direction? I mean, has the, I don't know, the Senate made any kind of resources available, or was it a simple declaration and leaving it at that? I mean, is this something that the American Armenian community can pursue and put the Armenian issue center stage once more? Are you aware of any kind of moves in that?
No, I'd love to be involved in that, because I do think that this is such an important moment in American history and such an important part of American understandings of debates over these sort of issues. And I don't think we quite have the right historical memory of it at the moment. It is the sort of this debate, I think, is sort of the crux of. I mean, Samantha Power's book has been very, very influential. Her book on A Problem from Hell, America and the Age of Genocide. But my sense is that there's an element of looking at sort of an American indifference and inaction there that doesn't quite sort of capture the complexity of the debate that goes on in this period. And I think there's a lot that can be learned from this. And I've done talks at quite a lot of American universities as part of like courses now, Johns Hopkins, University of Virginia. And I do think there's in the sort of academic community, I think there's an increasing sense, not just in the academic community, but also among sort of think tanks as well, of that this is essentially a very critically important case study for people who are looking at these debates to explore, that we shouldn't just be looking at debates where interventions did occur. As you mentioned before, Ara, studying the tragedy of things is that's what history should teach us, the sort of tragic ironies, and that's where the lessons are to be learned, rather than just looking at sort of the same case studies and the same sort of examples of successes, when actually we should be looking at sort of, well, why didn't this work out? Could it have worked out differently? What were these dilemmas that the policymakers were dealing with then and are still dealing with today?
Right. May I ask one more question?
Yes, go ahead.
Obviously, genocide is genocide related, but have you dealt with official Turkish historians? I mean, I have no doubt that the more prominence you get, they will begin to engage elements of what you have to say to disintegrate the points that you're trying to make. I mean, this is my experience. Have you come across that type of scenarios yet? I'm sure you will, but have you already or not?
But not so much so far. I mean, the Turkish historians who I've dealt with have often been people like Umit Ungor and those who are sort of sympathetic to this line of reasoning. But yeah, I mean, I think one of my attempts to look at this in its historical sense, rather than and to try and sort of inhabit this sort of experience at the time, was to sort of address some of those challenges before they came up, because I think what occurs there, I mean, as I say, you can't always sort of shield yourself from any of these challenges, but these debates are very much in the sort of the language of the time. It's not something where I'm applying back these ideas of humanitarian intervention. These are what the figures at the time understood. They understood what was going on in the Ottoman Empire. They saw it as the destruction of a people, and that's why this was a sense of intervention that was seen as. And as I say, I think certain terms can sort of in historical debates end up sort of acting as flags to people. But I think when you're looking through these debates, you can see the sort of echoes of some of the things that we still understand today. But these are sort of terms that contemporaries are using.
Well, I mean, the reason I said that, I mean, I can give you some examples. For example, Justin McCarthy would say the American understanding of what was happening in the Ottoman Empire was colored by missionaries who were prejudiced against Muslims. They made up stories. The Americans were misinformed. They fed into imperialist design. I mean, this type of rhetoric, because Turkey has think tanks. I mean, government-sponsored think tanks that develop position papers and they disseminate in the sort of free Western academia. And it's something that it will happen. One has to anticipate it. I just wanted to know whether it's already started or that's something for the future. But I've come across some of it.
Very much, yeah. But I think that's, and I can understand that would be the sort of line of criticism. I think that's to sort of, I think that line of criticism would be to sort of to misinterpret, I think, to a certain extent, the missionary position. I mean, the missionaries have very much an interest actually in, and you see this within sort of when you go through the missionary archives. At the time, they don't really want to play up this too much because they're concerned about interventions. They're concerned that ultimately that this is going to undermine their position. So they're not quite as just dupes for a certain way of thinking as they're very much actors in their own right, and so they don't necessarily have an interest in this. But it's not so much there's the missionary lobby at the top, but the role of individual missionaries, and I think we get very much a sense from those archives of exactly what's going on. So
okay, to be fair, you answered the question. The archival evidence is clear. There will be fake scholarship always, and the point that you first made is also bang on, that today there are Turkish scholars themselves who do some of the best work out there. So it's not analogous in many ways because the field has moved on. Yeah. But it will happen, and it's simply a matter of interest that I asked the question. Thank you.
Thank you. And I think it's one of those things that, I mean, I looking at sort of scholars like Donald Bloxham or others who I have been in contact with quite closely, is that I think they have done more. I mean, I think the terms of what I'm looking at are more about the debates over international intervention. Right. It's slightly different approach, I suppose, to what, say, someone like him or Tama Akçam or others are looking into. Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, thank you. Yes, our guest has been Dr. Charlie Laderman, and the book again is called Sharing the Burden: The Armenian Question, Humanitarian Intervention, and Anglo-American Visions of Global Order. It is really a fascinating read into this period because it does give us some valuable lessons for today. I want to thank you, Ara Sarafian, for joining us, also from London, to be a discussant and to ask questions. This lecture presentation has been recorded on YouTube, on the Armenian Studies Program YouTube channel. And so if you're interested in going back or telling friends about it, they can watch that. So thanks again for joining us with the Armenian Studies Program, and we'll see you at our next event. Thank you.
Thank you, brother.